So I want to introduce our guest. Nicole Banowetz is a Denver-based artist who is known for creating giant inflatable sculptures of microscopic creatures. Her work has been shown internationally, appearing in shows in the Netherlands, Russia, Sweden, Taiwan, and Poland. But also closer here to Traverse City, she actually was had a show at the Marshall M. Frederick Sculpture Museum at Saginaw Valley State University in 2018. SVSU is a partner of ours that we've worked with many, many times over the 30 years that we've been open. And so it was nice to see that that connection exists with Nicole's work. As part of a virtual residency, you might call it, she will be producing some instructional videos for us. So you'll keep an eye out for that coming up later this spring. That will demonstrate how to make some inflatable sculptures with household products. And she'll also be setting up some schedules to meet with Scimatech is what they call it at Traverse City Area Public Schools. So science, math, technology, Scimatech and art classes here at TCAPS at the middle and high school level. So we're excited to be able to get some, a living, working artist to meet with some young, impressionable students to maybe encourage them to go into the arts and see where that goes. So we appreciate that, and we appreciate Nicole being here tonight. And so, Nicole, I'll let you just say hi to everybody, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be able to speak with you and talk about not only my work, but all the amazing work in this show. So it's going to be really great.
And we've done quite a few of these kinds of programs where we're talking with artists. And I like to start out with the hardest question, which is, how are you? How has this year been? This year has been tough for a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. But as an art museum, we want to ask, as an artist, what has this past year been for you?
Oh, wow. Yeah, no, I didn't actually expect that question, but as an artist who makes inflatables, a lot of the work I do is for giant, festivals. I show internationally. So it's been a really quiet year for me, and it's been a lot of thinking about what's happening in the world and introspection. And so I feel like it's really been a year for me to slow down and look at what I'm doing and think a lot about it.
Sure. Have you adjusted your size in terms of things you've been working on? If you're not able to work in those large scale kinds of projects, or have you not found that has been impacted much?
I haven't changed like the space I'm working out of. And the thing that's really cool about making inflatables is that you don't need a lot of space to physically make it, because right. I'm just sewing it when it's deflated, and then I take it out in my backyard and inflate it. So that's one of the amazing things about inflatables, is you don't need a ton of resources when you're making them yourself to make really big work. Okay, so just so you know a little bit about me and why I'm talking about inflatables, I have been making inflatables about 10 years. So like I said, not as long as some of the artists in the show, but inflatables is the main part of my practice now. I do a few other materials, but mostly I make inflatables. The first inflatables I ever made were about 12 years ago, and it was part of my job. I was making inflatables actually for a holiday light show. So an artist that I worked for wanted to make giant toys, and so I learned how to make inflatables as part of my job for this, and I just fell in love with the process for all the reasons I've said already. But here on the screen, I'm showing a few of my wearable inflatables. And so these pieces are inflatable sculptures that I make, that there's a backpack and a series of batteries and fans integrated into the sculptures so that I can wear them and they inflate off of my body. And like I've been talking about, this idea of the inflatable as this joyful, soft object that really pulls people in and makes them want to interact with it. That's something I'm really interested in. But I'm also interested in this idea of the message that comes along with kind of a story, a connection to the environment. So this piece is one of the most recent pieces I've completed. It was actually right before the pandemic. I had a residency in Joshua Tree. And here is it's the Yucca moth and the Joshua tree, and they have what's called an obligate mutualist relationship, which means they both need one another to survive. So nothing else can pollinate the Joshua tree other than the Yucca moth. And the Yucca moth larva cannot survive anywhere else. So if one of those species dies, the other will also die. And as climate change is happening more and more, Joshua trees can't survive in certain environments, and the same with the moths. So I wanted to kind of bring attention to this issue in this performance I made in my residency. So here I am the moth, and this is the Joshua tree. And so I have these kind of pollen on my head, and I'm pollinating the dead Joshua tree. So it's sort of this sad story about what's happening with our environment. But I start with this inflatable, which brings people in and makes people want to interact with that story. So it's sort of like almost tricking people into the subject matter that then becomes more sad. But generally, all of my work is inspired by nature, and often microscopic nature specifically. So I love this idea of taking tiny microscopic things and making them really large. And specifically, I often look for stories in nature that I think talk really well about humans. And this is a piece, I actually made this quite a few years ago, but it's taken on a whole new meaning recently. It's called Outbreak. And here I showed it in Sweden, it was on their town hall. And so the forms on the front here are a mixture of bacteria and viruses, and they're weaving around the building. And at the time, I was interested in this idea of these tiny, really powerful things that are all around us that we didn't really think about that much before, like the idea that we weren't really paying attention to the microscopic environment. Of course, that has changed dramatically in the last year. But some of the things that are on the wall are the stomach bacteria, smallpox. Smallpox is interesting because it's the only virus that we've been able to eradicate with a vaccine. Smallpox only exists like in 2 places. It's like under lock and key in Russia and in the US in these different science laboratories. So that's interesting. And then this is an earlier version of the work, but you can kind of see how I'm looking at these microscopic forms and then making them large. So these tiny, powerful things, and then I make them large and playful. So I like that kind of difference between the mighty, tiny thing and the giant, playful thing. This is a large installation that I made more recently, and it's called the Incubation Effect. And this piece is it was at the Denver Art Museum for about a year. And one thing I'm really interested in is getting people to interact with the art and have an experience. So this was in a part of the museum that was meant to be an interactive gallery, and specifically meant to make families have activities to interact with. So on the floor, there were all these plush larvae that I created. And so people could play with these larvae, move them around. And there were also this kind of laboratory desk area where you could draw what you thought these larvae were going to become. And so you'd interact with this whole installation that has all of these different larvae that are in these incubation chambers, and they're all changing into new things. And a lot of it is about this idea of potential and what will these things become, and how can you as the audience affect what they become. And I also am really interested in science fiction. And with this piece, I was thinking about Frankenstein's monster and this idea that the monster came into the world innocent and it could have become anything. But because people treated it like a monster, it became a monster. And so if it had a different experience with the world and its environment, what might Frankenstein's monster have become? What responsibility did Frankenstein have to his own monster? So in this gallery, it's the responsibility of everyone that interacts with these larvae to treat them a certain way. And from the way they're treated, they're going to turn into something. And so these are the hundreds of drawings that I collected from people imagining what amazing creatures my larva might become. And what I actually did is make new creatures that later were put into the installation, inspired by these drawings. So I wanted to really empower the audience. So not only can you affect what these creatures become, you are affecting what the artist is going to create. So they could come back and maybe say like, oh, I drew some sort of appendage that looked like this. Maybe that's my drawing. And the people coming into the gallery could continue to be engaged with the artwork. And that piece
Nicole.
was up for, oh yes.
Oh no, I wanted to ask a little bit more about this. So can you talk about the timeline here? I mean, how long was this up and installed, and how long was it between getting a drawing and creating a new creature out of that drawing?
Yeah, so it was up for about 1 year, and when I installed it, I waited about 3 months, and then I got that set of drawings. I brought them all home. I organized them and chose some of my favorites and kind of merged them together. And so then I brought one creature in, and then the next 3 months would happen. I'd get another set of drawings. And so I made 3 new additions to the installation throughout the year.
That's so fun. I love that idea that the visitors are adding to the work as it continues through the year. What year was this at the museum?
It was going there through 2018 and 2019. So
okay,
it was pretty recently.
Okay, yeah, Chelsea here at the museum she just said in the chat she actually saw this show, so it's a great full circle for her to have seen this and now be with us hosting you. So that's great.
Yeah, should I keep going?
Oh yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so this piece I showed a little bit earlier in a slide, but this is called Distended Defense, and it's another one of my wearable sculptures. And in this piece, I was inspired by Diametic Behaviors, which are a behavior by an animal or an insect where they trick their predator. So you can see some examples here, like the fake 2 heads of a caterpillar or the eye spots on a moth. And so my creature is sort of my fake protection. So I was thinking about this idea of this vulnerable body and how do I protect myself? And so I created this giant space taking up spiky kind of monster with this idea that it could protect me, but in reality, it's all soft fabric and air. So it's similar to these insects where they're not real defense mechanisms. And this creature that I made has had many lives in different art projects that I've done. And so here is a performance piece that I did with a collaborator of mine, Chris Bagley, where I performed with his kind of otherworldly projections on my sculptures. And people were invited to put on these Tyvek suits and come and meet me as though I was this alien creature. Or they could enter this inflatable gallery where they would see the projection of my performance that was happening next door on the wall. So it's meant to feel like this weird sci-fi environment where you didn't know what was real and what was false. And so here you can see the woman that's reaching out to touch me, and I'm actually in the other room. And so I'm reaching, and they're seeing that projection of me performing.
It feels very timely in our virtual world.
I know, it's really strange to like rethink about work in this context, because I actually, when you were talking about what I've done when the pandemic started, I actually took this inflatable gallery out into my backyard, and I made a series of performances inside of it that felt like me and my sculptures were in this isolated area. So this inflatable space got a whole new life for the pandemic.
Yeah, it's sort of creating something, and then the world around you is informing it more, and then you're able to sort of reinterpret it.
Yeah, definitely. So this is another form I'm inspired by, is the slime mold. And this piece is called Life of the Slime Mold, and I showed it at the Amsterdam Light Festival. This is it during the day and in my backyard. But I was really interested in the slime mold because I think we as humans have this idea that we are more intelligent or better than other species or creatures. And the slime mold is actually this really interesting thing because it it obviously doesn't have a brain, but it's really has this kind of intelligence, and it has a memory. And it's so cool because just today I read that they've done more recent studies about the slime mold, and it actually creates this memory that's like a physical memory it makes its like tendrils thicker or thinner depending on if it finds food. And then it has a physical memory that it's created to help it find the food again. And it's also super efficient. They did this interesting study quite a while ago where they took a map of Tokyo and they put food on the map based on how populated areas are, and then they let the slime mold grow. And within 26 hours, it had mapped the most efficient route of the Tokyo system. And the actual Tokyo network, took human engineers tons of planning time. They had to make all of these maps and things, but the mold was able to do that in like a day. And so I think it's interesting to think about intelligence and what intelligence is. And we as humans need to be more open to different sorts of intelligence that are out there. And here's a picture of it at night. So it has lights that kind of pulse through it. So it feels like the slime mold is growing across the night sky above the canal. And so this is another piece that's similar in that with the slime mold, I was interested in this different kind of ideas of intelligence. And with this piece concerning plants, a mythic conversation, I'm interested in plant communication. So again, we as humans don't always look at the different kinds of communication, even within our own species, let alone looking at animals and plants and thinking about the way they communicate. There's more and more scientific research about the way that plants can communicate. So I wanted to make this kind of playful rendition of a root system that was communicating. So one of the ways that plants can communicate is through this network of fungus that's underground. It's like a mycelium network that can actually take messages between different trees. And it does that in exchange for the trees giving it nutrients. And so they have this relationship. There's also these really beautiful stories. For example, this image where there's this stump. Trees actually have relationships with one another and they care about elders in their community. So when important trees are cut down, for no reason that seems, just for survival, the trees will actually feed nutrients to stumps that were like the matriarchs of their group to keep them alive. So for years and years, these stumps that have been cut down will be kept alive by the group. They also will share resources with their young to help them grow when they're too small to actually get the sunlight. So there's a lot of communications and relationships happening in plants that we don't necessarily think about. So I'm looking at that, but then I'm also interested in the rhizome, which is when you think about garlic, it's like a rhizome. The root system is kind of these strange bulbous growing roots rather than when we think about a tree that has up, down kind of straight roots. So the rhizome has also been used as a different kind of thought system. So if you think about a normal tree root, you think about there's a hierarchy. There's the up is more important, and then there's down, and there's one path, whereas the rhizome has no beginning or end, and everything spills out. So there's a lot of different paths to get to the right answer. So it's this idea that it's a more connected thought system. So I was thinking about all of that when I made these pieces, and they went out into the forest in Breckenridge in Colorado, and they would be turned on during the day. This was also an interesting feat because I had to take batteries up on the trail every day and then take them back home and charge them at night. So getting the work out into nature was kind of an ordeal, but I really love them just coming out of nowhere there. And I actually have one of my favorite stories came from this piece because I met a man on the trail and he asked me if I was the artist. And he said to me, I don't understand anything about art, but then he put his two fingers together and he said, but when I looked at your sculpture, I understood the E.T. moment. And I just thought that was so beautiful because he obviously very much did understand my art, because E.T. is again like this idea of we can communicate with all different sorts of beings. And so the fact that he said he didn't understand art, but he understood ET was like, oh yes, you understand it exactly. So for me, that was a beautiful story.
Yeah, that is, I can imagine walking on a trail and coming up upon this and just kind of, it would sort of force you to stop and wonder what's going on. I'm curious, with works like this, and I think several others, that you've worked with this specifically kind of white fabric. And even though it is in an environment where you might expect to see more sort of blending in or earth tones or those kinds of things, could you talk a little bit about that choice as an artist, you know, in terms of the color of the fabric or what fabric you choose for these kinds of projects?
Yeah, so when I first started making inflatables, I only made white inflatables for probably 5 or 7 years. And part of it was just that I was learning about form, and I really thought the white drew attention to the forms, and it had this kind of surreal, calming, sterile feel that I really loved. So part of it was that I loved the feeling of the white fabric, but I also was a little intimidated by color, especially given that there's only certain colors available of the fabric I use. And so if I want really unique colors, I might have to dye them, and that's kind of a more complex process. So it took me a while to just get the confidence to like bring the color in. So now I feel like for each project, I kind of decide if it makes sense in white or black and white or color. So now I use all variety.
Sure. As I say, it's a stark contrast, as I mentioned, your background earlier. I mean, there's lots of colors and patterns there, and then to see these white, forms, but I get the contrast of it. It's kind of fantastic. I want to just encourage folks to, if you have a question, pop into the chat, and I'll let Nicole kind of keep going here, and I'm not sure how many more slides you have.
Yeah,
but,
how are we doing on time? I think I just was going to talk about my process, and that's kind of the last section I have.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we don't really have a hard time on these. We go about an hour-ish, and so we've got, another 10, 15 minutes. But if people are engaged and want to ask questions, I'm happy to go a little longer. It's not a big deal.
Okay, great. Yeah, so my process, as you can see, I think a ton about the like forms that I choose. So I spend a lot of time reading science articles and just looking at interesting images of microscopic things. The first thing I always do is kind of look out into the world to see what's going to inspire me. And sometimes that is as easy as like I'm going on a hike and I see something cool and it makes me think about it. And then I research what that thing is I saw. The second thing I do is I do drawings. I'm very analog. I don't do a lot of computer stuff. So my drawings are often very simple, quick, hand-drawn line drawings. But they often, I think, actually do reference the piece pretty specifically. So you get an idea from my drawing what it's going to look like, even though it's a very simple, non-technical drawing. You can see a few more of these drawings. And then, so like what I talked about, this idea that I have to get that thing that is a three-dimensional form in my mind into an inflatable, which means I need to break it down into these planes and make patterns. And sometimes, especially when I first started making, that was really hard. And so I have what I studied was sculpture, and I did more traditional sculpture. And so I'll make these tiny models, usually just out of like Fimo clay. And then when I physically have this tiny sculpture, I can really imagine how to break it down into those paper patterns. And so I'll often sculpt all these different parts of a sculpture that I'm interested in making, because then I can look at it and say, oh, this makes sense. This is a sphere, and then this is a trumpet shape, and I can draw from those. And I now have just like bags and bags of patterns. So every time I make a sculpture, I label the pattern, I put it in a bag, and then the next time I'm like, oh, I want to make a form that also looks like this thing, I can pull out that pattern and I can use it. So here, I have the paper patterns, and those are what I use to then cut and make the sculpture. So literally every scene you see on one of my sculptures, there is a piece of paper that corresponds to it that I have in my studio. So here you can see I use just a I use like a lot of old vintage kind of sewing machines because they're a lot stronger than the new sewing machines I find, but I also have a sail making sewing machine that's like a semi-industrial machine that I use. And yeah, it's pretty much as simple as me sewing it together in my studio, taking it outside and inflating it, figuring out what I need to change. I've gotten a lot better. I don't have to try a ton of times to get the form I want like I used to have to. So that's great. And then the last part of the process is just installing it. And that can be as simple as me on a ladder hanging the work, or it can be as complex as a whole crew with a boom lift, like pulling the work up into the air. So
it's a great chance to see that the process side of these kinds of things, I think, because I think generally speaking, most people understand an artist's approach to a painting, right? Oh, I draw a sketch, I transfer the sketch to a canvas, I start with some outlines and some paint, and then I fill it in, right? I mean, I think most of us learn that in elementary school and high school, those kinds of basic senses. So I think with this kind of exhibition and this media, it is a struggle to think about, like, how do they do it? Is it just a lot of trial and error, or how do they plan it? And someone like Sharon Engelstein, who does this three-dimensional drawing in her computer and then sends it off to have it produced, is certainly one process to do that. But having the other aspect of it, like you said, analog, of having to cut and trim and change things as you go. I thought that was really interesting to hear about the Fimo clay, and that makes sense to me. To try to visualize something in 3 dimensions is always a little tough, even if you're really good at it. So to produce something in 3 dimensions and then be able to work from that as a scale model was interesting to hear about. I was curious if you're, on your end, you mentioned you had all these paper pieces that sort of shape the pieces. Have you ever done anything with those pieces? Have you ever made something out of, the templates that you have laying around?
no, I often show them to people though, because people are always interested to see those paper patterns. But to me, they're really precious because I reuse them so much. Because if you look at my work, you'll start to say like, oh, that's like a form that she's using, because I can take that pattern and make it bigger and add appendages to it, and suddenly it's a new thing. So it's really, those patterns to me are so precious. Like once I get a really good pattern, I like love it and I use it over and over again.
Sure. And there was one question as I was typing up my notes, I noticed it's on the chromoforms piece, and the materials listed is the dichroic vinyl, which we discussed, and sealed air, right? And so this idea of air being the material that you're using when you're working with inflatable sculpture, I wonder if do you think of it in that way? Is it the material you're using, or is it just kind of, is it like the paintbrush as opposed to the actual paint, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think of air as a material because when you're designing an inflatable, you always have to think about everything being pushed out by that air. It's not the same as when you're sculpting from clay and you don't have to think about that. So it's like there's so much tension in the way the air is going to push out, but also there's so much, in the same way that Max talks about, there's so much power in that air to like go away. And what if it suddenly turns off and starts to shrink away? So I think the air is a really important part of it. And I think a lot of it about breath and life, and the life that is given to the sculptures through that air.
Yeah, and that was one thing that I picked up on with, I think with Max's work, and I'm sure other artists like yourself and others that work in inflatables, we have a substantial collection of Inuit art mostly from the Canadian Arctic, and it's a 20th and 21st century group of art and artists, but they in their culture and in their traditional culture, and often reflected in their art, is this sense of a spirit or a breath or an air that we are all breathing, that we are all part of, that is part of what makes us live and alive. And so it was interesting to kind of get this sense from Max's work, this contemporary artist who maybe knows nothing about some of these kind of cultural things from different parts of the world, but sharing that same kind of idea was really kind of a fun connection to make once we started installing it and thinking about what the work looked like and kind of what kind of themes it was working around.
Yeah, and I do think there's kind of the connection with that to this aliveness of an inflatable. It's full of this air, which is like this life breath, but also because it's soft and it's almost vibrating. I feel like the work feels alive in a way that other sculpture might not feel.
Yeah, and speaking of vibrating, that makes a lot of noise, right? So what about that aspect of it? I mean, have you utilized it in unique ways? Have you tried to eliminate it? Have you tried to cover it up? You know, those kinds of things. What kind of approaches do you have for that?
So usually wherever the work is, people want it covered up because no one really wants the sound of it. It's not like a beautiful sound. It's more like an annoying background hum all the time. So often every places that I show don't want the sound to exist. But I have done some work where I've added sound in hopes to kind of integrate the sound into it. Like the performance where I did that had the kind of inflatable cube area and myself performing, we had like weird kind of sci-fi sounds that kind of interacted with the blower sound. And in the incubation effect, we had larva like crunching kind of weird squeaky larva sounds. So I think I can play with kind of sound that kind of interacts with the blower. I've never been able to get the blower to completely disappear, really. And
Sure.
it doesn't bother me as much as it bothers other institutions.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's the day in, day out of it. You know, I mean, our staff that's at the front desk is getting a lot more of it than I
Yeah.
am here back here in the office. But it's certainly something that is different than again than a painting or a sculpture. It has an element that impacts your interaction with the work in some way. So, talk a little bit, maybe a little bit about you know your work with students and kids and families and that kind of thing, because I know you'll be doing some of that here in terms of producing some videos for us that we'll be able to share, and hopefully we'll be able to connect some scheduling dots with some middle and high school classes. So just talk about maybe your experience with that, or what about it is enjoyable for you to be able to talk about your work with that audience.
Yeah, well, I think of education as kind of a part of my work. And I think working with young people or just educating people about, the state of the environment and things is really important. So I love having classes specifically that work with kind of science material and we translate it into the arts. But specifically working with inflatables is really amazing because students often get so excited that they can go through this process and then at the end they blow it up and it's an inflatable because it's an object that as a young person you interact with these inflatable kinds of objects as toys or as a part of your culture, but you don't necessarily think, oh, I could make that thing. So I really love the moment that I help a student inflate an inflatable on a fan and they're like, wow, this thing just came to life.
Yeah, and do you find do you often work more with the sort of science and tech students, or is it more often with art classes, or has it been a mix?
It's usually a mix. I often do workshops through a group that exists in Colorado called Think 360, and they bring professional artists into schools. And so anytime a teacher can look at my profile and ask to bring me in. And so I've been brought in by math and science teachers, but I've also been brought in by arts teachers. So I've worked in all different kinds of classrooms and with all different ages. I've worked with, elementary through high school doing different kinds of projects.
With for Blow Up 2, something to kind of consider as people visit and explore the exhibition, and then we'll kind of wrap it up.
Yeah, well, I hope that people get a chance to see the exhibition because I think that seeing inflatables in person, it's hard to imagine them when you're not in person because they come so to life with the way that the air fills them up and the way they take over a space. So I think Blow Up 2, I actually saw Blow Up 1 and I really enjoyed it. And I think Blow Up 2 is coming to Colorado. And so I'm going to get to see it, but I haven't seen it yet. But it's just such an interesting variety of work that I think it is something you should definitely see in person if you can.